Welcome, everyone. Bienvenue, bienvenidos, bienvenidos. Thank you for joining us today, March 15, 2025, to the event Geopolitical Discourses in the Americas. I am honored to host this panel. I'm very happy to welcome high-esteemed colleagues and friends who come from various parts of this vast continent, and that I'll introduce them in a minute. My name is Hilda Fernandez, and I greet you on behalf of the former Lacan Salon, which, following a collective desire, has declared itself Corpo Freudiano Vancouver Lacanian School of Psychoanalysis last March the 2nd. We are committed to the transmission of psychoanalysis and the formation of analysts in Vancouver. We will have many events to mark this act, celebrate it, and share our programs. We are located in Vancouver, Canada, on the unceded and ancestral territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Geopolitical Discourses in the Americas is the first of various panels that we will be hosting in the next months to address various regions of the world. Geopolitics refers to the old concept of geography is destiny, and the idea that physical proximity between lands and nations shapes international relations and politics, creating both antagonisms and opportunities. Discourse, on the other hand, refers to what Lacan developed in his theory of discourse, understood as the form of social bonding that is both shaped by and shaping the structure of language, even if words are not exchanged. It operates as a manifestation of the real, driven by a compulsive repetitions that materializes in the conditions of land, resources, and people. Rather than merely a tool for protest, Lacan's theory of discourse offers a method to uncover and interrogate the logic that perpetuates these structural conditions. Perhaps the geopolitical landscapes of present mirrors our response to the COVID-19 pandemic, where we united against a global contingency. Today, we face a similar imperative, confronting the ominous rise of fascism in the world, or more precisely, the structural conditions that perpetuate it. Just as we engage in public discourse during the pandemic, we must now develop hopeful, yet realistic and critically informed discourses to address this urgent challenge, taking in consideration the unconscious subject. The American continent has three large regions. The North has 3 countries. Central America and the Caribbean counts with 20 countries, and South America with 12. Our panelists today come from various regions of the vast Americas. Mario Eduardo Costa Pereiro from Brazil is a psychiatrist and psychoanalyst, vice director of the Núcleo Sao Paulo of the Corpo Freudiano School of Psychoanalysis. He's full professor in clinical psychopathology at the University de Provence, France, as well as an associate professor in psychopathology at Unicamp. He's the author of the books Pánico y Desamparo, Psicopatología dos Ataques de Pánico, y Erótica do Sono. This last book, I am reading it before going to sleep, is fascinating. Bem-vindo, Mario Eduardo.
Gracias. I'm very glad to be here among so important and then brilliant colleagues and to talk to you about these very important and urgent questions you have to face today.
Thank you. Patricia Gherovici, she's PhD, a psychoanalyst, analytic supervisor, and recipient of the 2020 Sigourney Award for her clinical and scholarly work with Latinx and gender variant communities. She teaches at the New School for Social Research. Her single author books include The Puerto Rican Syndrome, Please Select Your Gender, and Transgender Psychoanalysis, a Lacanian perspective on sexual difference. Her work on these complex themes is canon now. Very happy to have you here, Patricia. Bienvenida. I'm Johal.
Sorry, I was muted. So to echo the fears of the North American analog, the US context, I hope I won't be muted. Thank you for the invitation, Hilda. I'm very glad to be here, and I'm delighted and excited to have this possibility of the exchange we're going to have right now. Thank you for having me here.
Thank you. I'm Johal. has previously been director of SFU Van City Office of Community Engagement, VOCE. Many of us are still protesting the sudden closing of this amazing community hub. Check Voices for VOCE. Is co-director as well of SFU's Community Engaged Research Initiative and host of the podcast Below the Radar. He also is affiliated to Graduate Liberal Studies at SFU, Labor Studies, and the Institute for the Humanities. He's the author of Ecological Metapolitics, Badu and the Anthropocene, and co-author with Matt Earn of two books, Global Warming and the Sweetness of Life, A Tarzan's Tale, and Oh My Friends, There's No Friend, The Politics of Friendship at the End of Ecology. We are longtime friends and have collaborated in many projects together. Pleasure to have you here.
Wonderful to be with you, and I really look forward to this conversation and many more that we need to have in the coming months and years.
Totally. Thank you. David Pavon-Cuellar is a professor of Marxism, social psychology, and psychoanalysis at the State University of Michoacán, Universidad Michoacana de San Nicolás, de Hidalgo, Morelia. He's the author of several books, among them Marxism Lacanian, From the Conscious Interior to an Exterior Unconscious, Lacan Discourse Analysis and Social Psychology, and Elementos Políticos de Marxismo Lacaniano, as well as co-editor with Ian Parker of Lacan Discourse Event, New Psychoanalytic Approaches to Textual Indeterminacy. David's work has influenced my own research, and it's great to have you here. Bienvenido, David.
Thank you very much, Hilda. It's also great for me to be here. And that's
Great, thank you. Daniel Scarfo is a polymath, an explorer of poetics, lives, and values, PhD in Spanish and Portuguese, and licenciado in Sociología por la Universidad de Buenos Aires. Besides, he studied comparative literature in the University of Puerto Rico and Portuguese studies in the University of Lisbon. He also lived in Brazil and taught at universities in Argentina, Canada, and the US. Daniel was my professor at UBC when I studied a master's in literature and still remember the course on impossible literatures. Borges, Bataille, Rulfo, great professor and friend. Bienvenido, Daniel.
Muchas gracias, Hilda.
Daniel Tutt is a philosopher with a focus on psychoanalytic theory and Marxist thought. He's the author of Psychoanalysis and the Politics of the Family, The Crisis of Initiation, with the Palgrave Lacan series, and How to Read Like a Parasite, Why the Left Got High on Nietzsche. He has taught philosophy at George Washington University, Marymount University, and the Washington, D.C. Jail. He's a senior research fellow at the Global Center for Advanced Studies. I have never met Daniel in person, but was one of the first people I follow on Twitter, and I have followed his research as well. Welcome, Daniel.
Thank you very much, Hilda. Wonderful to be here with friends and comrades alike. Thank you.
Wonderful. This is a promising dialogue in which each panelist will share their assessment and concerns about the region, or the region at large, or the world at large, as well as the horizons and challenges we face, ending with possible actions or interventions needed, suggested. Before each speaker, I'll offer some context to the region, just because. Only a few weeks into his presidency, Donald Trump and his techno-feudalist oligarch friends have effectively transformed the United States of America into a far-right authoritarian regime with unmistakable signs of fascism. This alarming shift is manifested in the accelerated erosion of social institutions, the seizure of media communications, the scapegoating of immigrants, the dismantling of international treaties and agreements through the so-called tariff war, the slashing of social funding, and the ominous threats of international expansionism. This without counting the debasing of the public sphere, which is now a spectacle, an infomercial, a telenovela, Guy Debord predicted a televised baseness, a social compilation of images that concentrates false consciousness. This would make good TV, he said. From not Debord. What is the status of the left in North America and in Latin America? What are forms of organized resistance? What other discourses are emerging? These are kind of questions that we are aimed to deconstruct. Let's start with Canada. The US economic protectionism has manifested in imposed tariffs to their immediate neighbors, Canada and Mexico, on the pretext of a mismanagement of immigration and drug trafficking of fentanyl. Justin Trudeau had ended his 10 years mandate as prime minister amidst this commercial war and the ridiculous but concerning threats of annexing Canada to the US as a 51st state. Mark Carney just yesterday sworn as new prime minister. Canada currently has responded with elbows up politics, a term derived from a phallic strategic in hockey play to secure defense, which subsequently has led Canada to a resurgence of a patriotic spirit with the purpose of boycotting American goods. What is your assessment?
Thank you, Hilda, for the invitation. I'll get into the parts about Canada a little bit later, but just to begin, I'm coming to you from the territories of the Chouette people in the interior BC. I'm in the basement of my parents' house because they've been going through some health challenges, and look forward to the conversation today. I'm going to talk a little bit about this eternal return of geopolitics. And to begin with, that, critical theory is meaningless if it doesn't engage in the critique of fascism. The US, and increasingly everywhere, is at a political precipice where the institutions of democracy are being transformed into instruments of authoritarian rule in real time before our eyes through both electoral success and very little opposition, entire departments shut down with a snap of the finger and executive orders. Geopolitical choke points like the Panama Canal, Canadian North, Greenland, have a geopolitical logic built around American interests that is simply a rearticulation of a contemporary Monroe doctrine. So it's an imperial project that projects back to the 19th century, especially amongst the far right. So it may be accurate to call it part of the new imperialism we are witnessing today as part of the grand chessboard of American politics, including its turn on Ukraine and its longer term agenda of reassigning American military assets to Asia over the 21st century. The moment is heightened, volatile, and primed for potential political and communal violence, especially when a match is struck within an already combustible atmosphere, accelerated by planetary scale computation and algorithmic acceleration. The challenge ahead is not just to oppose, but to build an affirmative politics, to construct a politics that can endure beyond moments of crisis and establish lasting material alternatives to reactionary rule, and liberating oneself from the task of responding always in a defensive way, but to carve out the time and space to think together. We must just not respond on the defensive, but we must allow room for the necessary contemplation to genuinely understand the stakes of the moment in order to respond with the necessary political and gravitational force that functions at the scale of the problem. Without contemplation, we lose our relationship to language, our very capacity to resist. Contemplation and inactivity liberates the immanence of life to move beyond a state of capture from the ongoing production and pollution of digital disorientation. Inactivity can remove us from mere life. It's not an argument for depoliticization or apathy or narcissism, but a call for the space and time to provide a refuge for the imperishable, a kind of exalted time, a suspending of time, to move beyond estrangement, dislocation, and to provide a mode, movement, a sequence to recapture the potency of the political that has been run aground by the very real losses of the present. The ecstatic trance that we long for communally strikes hot in this moment of political intensification. And politics today requires disappearance and reappearance and the capacity to touch, to breathe under the same sky, to remake this time with others. And the political concept of love is born in encounter, the right to move, the right to breathe, the right to remain, the capacity to corrupt the young, a provisional politics that delineates a space beyond the body, a politics of engraving, marking, imprinting solidarities, ruminating on the condition that makes the act come to be, and to invoke a practical politics of borderless solidarities, a call for promiscuous anti-fascist alliances, and a willingness to act on one's thinking, to put one's body on the line, an effort to stand firm in the storm of time. Trumpism and its geopolitical ramifications and insecure projections internally and externally should not be seen as an isolated phenomenon, but as part of a broad and ongoing shift in global politics and tied to diminishing American power. It's precisely in this lack that this overaggression is manifesting itself. Trumpism is merely a symptom of a broader disease. And we took a look at digital oligarchic authoritarianism playing a key role in shaping public perception, manipulating affect, accelerating anxieties in an era of rapid media saturation. The new nomos of the earth, to use a Schmittian term, is emerging, where digital landscapes, algorithmic control, media spectacle redefine the grammar of political combat. The oligarchic triumphalism is ever present. So how did the disenfranchised and the defeated become validated and gratified in the political sphere? Where do the outlets and pressure valves of frustration get their release? The far right is providing distorted answers, and the message from the progressive left can be seen as confusing. Trumpism's manipulation of public affect operates like adjusting a temperature gauge, dialing up outrage, resentment, and exhilaration to sustain political momentum. The daily traumas of modern life primed certain segments of the population for the movement's messaging, but this was a long time in the making. For many on the periphery of the political mainstream, Trump's crude and vengeful performance and rhetoric brought a sense of cathartic joy, even if it ultimately worked against their material interest. His ability to disrupt the pantomime of the duopoly politics created an illusion of authenticity and outsider rebellion despite operating within entrenched systems of power. But the Trump coalition has more opportunists and grifters than actual fascists. So what is the necessary politics of fracturing the right-wing coalition look like? What does a politics on the offensive based around the strategic imperative of fracture, capture, co-opting, disarming, de-radicalizing, dismantling the far right look like? The opportunists and the grifters will likely fold like a cheap tent when the fascist interventions draw a large enough backlash. How does that politics of new solidarities come to be? The fascist true believers in the coalition are organized, they have their hands on the policy levers and are unrolling the blueprint rapidly. Most of the rest of the coalition are backdrop fodder. So this group, even within that coalition, is a minority. And Trump is the archetypal American con man, a product of the late 20th century American spectacle. Trump merges reality TV, professional wrestling, theatrics, and aggressive branding into a dominant political force against prevailing norms and logics. Dismissing him as a relic of the 1980s on steroids underestimates the calculated nature of the political agenda and those in the shadows, in the back room, dreaming up the dark money nuts and bolts of the project. In a second term with control over the Senate, House, Supreme Court, 4,000 political appointees, his administration will be far more aggressive and structured in dismantling democratic institutions, dismantling the entire structures and funding bodies, and takeover of academics and art institutions through coercion and bullying, the threats to tax endowments of universities and charitable organizations. So this is no longer just improvisation, it's a refined strategy with an emboldened apparatus and a capacity to unroll a policy agenda like a bulldozer. It will take time for an appropriate resistance to form that functions at the scale of the problem. And we're in the moment of incalculable losses, biopolitics, incarceration, violent removals, and extreme border politics. I'm going to leave it at that. for now as we get to the rest of the questions. So thank you, Hilda.
Thank you. Your words are very moving. Yeah, it just went right to my heart. Thank you. Patricia, Trump's government brings the spectacle with him. He performs the signing of decrees and new laws every day in the media, plays with the horrors of people suffering. For example, the shameful situation of the Gazans by playing with an AI-produced dystopic construction of place. Trump delegates to Elon Musk and his sci-fi dodge, which have led to the instrumentalization of massive layoffs. Patricia, what is your assessment of how the population in the United States are reacting? How are these changes rippling into the consulting room? And based on your lived experience, work experience with Latinx population, how do you observe the tensions emerging in the US? Thank you.
Thank you, Hilda. Well, I will share maybe a little biographical information. I started working in the 1990s with the Puerto Rican community. I work in North Philadelphia in a ghettoized community, isolated by linguistic barriers, a population that survives in very challenging positions with 3 generations of unemployment. And there I did work as a psychoanalyst in a so-called mental health center. So I was quite in touch with the Puerto Rican community, with what was described as the Puerto Rican syndrome, which happens to be a return of the most classical form of hysteria, that I thought had disappeared. What in Spanish-speaking countries is known as ataque de nervios was codified from the Anglo perspective as a syndrome unique to Puerto Rican, the Puerto Rican syndromes. I'll bracket that off and maybe we go back because it is a very interesting point of connection between a purely clinical manifestation, somebody having something that looks like an epileptic attack with no organic correlation or an explosion of rage, that is at the same time, by the very name, political and clinical. It's a condensation of culture and subjectivity all at once. So imagine my surprise in the just weeks before the election in November. There was a last rally in Madison Square commemorating another rally at Madison Square, a Nazi rally that took place in the 30s. I was so shocked that there was one comedian that made a stupid joke of comparing I don't think it was a joke, was what I naively thought it was going to be something that would hinder Trump. He described the island of Puerto Rico as a, quote, floating island of garbage. And this horrible racist statement did not hurt Trump. I was so shocked to see that the Latino community supported Trump, despite the fact that they knew well that their interests were not going to be protected. So I think that this, which is, I think, an indication of many gestures, the presence of ICE deporting immigrants. There was a raid in Philadelphia in a restaurant that the members of the ICE, which is this group, we may call it paramilitary group, if we use the models of Latin America, that is in charge of gathering a southern people the day for deportation, made an intervention in a Puerto Rican-owned restaurant, forgetting, we may say with quotation marks, because we know that maybe for a psychoanalyst there is no forgetting, there is repressing perhaps, and they had forgotten that Puerto Ricans are US citizens who occupy a very ambiguous position. They're neither fully enfranchised nor deprived of certain rights that nevertheless they have access to as American citizens. So they're in an in-between position that in a way is symptomatically expressing a repressed history of colonialism of the US that supposedly was up to Trump, presenting itself in the international field as the defender of freedom and democracy. Maybe that will no longer be the presentation of the US. We see clearly a return to essentialism for a country that until now did not have an official language. Now we have one, it's English. And this is very important because the US is the most numerous Spanish-speaking country, second only to Mexico. There are more Spanish speakers in the US than in Colombia, Argentina, Spain. So I think this is not a coincidental gesture. So you may ask, I am identified not as a political scholar, I'm a psychoanalyst, I'm a clinician. How can I, as a psychoanalyst, authorize myself to address the current political situation? Here I take inspiration from Freud, who in the beginning of group psychology and analysis of the ego says that the contrast between individual psychology and social or group psychology that at first glance may seem full of significance loses a great deal of its sharpness when it is examined more closely. And another of the elements that Freud mentions is that we always have an other in the psychic life. There is always another in the subject, in the individual, that it could be this other, nevertheless, a problematic other. And this is maybe one way of thinking the current situation. This other involved, it could be a model, could be an object, could be a helper, but could also be an opponent. And again, Freud insists individual psychology is at the same time social psychology. And here, we don't have the time today to go in details, but I think that is urgent for anyone trying to understand this current situation using the tools of psychoanalysis to reread Freud's Massenpsychologie, Psicología de las Masas. In Spanish, it has been well translated, where we have, I think, perhaps the tool to understand this current situation, this return to fascism, and where I will only underline one element that Freud allow us to think about group formations, and there are two interesting symptoms that why is the text Massenpsychologie means translated into English as group psychology. Why does the signifier group replace the crowd? And I think this is quite revealing, and it has, I think, political echoes. As a curious footnote, in the Spanish version of the complete Freud's works, they have an illustration of what crowds look like. And for that, they bring up a picture from the US. It's a picture of a mass demonstration in the US in the 20s. The captions claim in this Ballesteros version of the complete works of Freud in Spanish that crowds became part of the American life before crowds appeared in European countries. It's interesting, this mistranslation, because one of the elements Freud proposes in this text is that groups and crowds are qualitatively different. Also, another point I would mention that is quite important given the reality we are living right now is the idea that whenever we have mass phenomena, we encounter segregation. That segregation is not secondary, it's not a consequence, but rather is the crowd's formation. What constitutes the crowd is segregation. And segregation could be, just for the purpose of our argument today, defined as disavowal of difference. That all group formations erase difference since their constitution is based on a principle of identity, and that any attempt at not just stressing difference, even at tolerating difference, no matter how minimal, can be experienced by the crowd as an attack that threatens its very existence. Against the grain of the logic of group formations, psychoanalysis opens up a different kind of discourse, a space where we not only tolerate the difference, but there is a desire for difference. And that analysts should remain prudent, that they have to be always on their guard against the temptation of playing the prophet, the master, and retain from any practice of suggestion, abstaining from exercising what in this text Freud calls hypnosis, described as a crowd of two. Only two people are necessary to have a crowd phenomenon. I will not go into the details of the issue of this text, which I find extremely important for us. I will just make one last comment about this text to move on to my last point in my words today, would be that perhaps when Freud wrote this text, it was a moment when the idea of masses was quite prevalent, and the meditation about what political powers could crowd represent. And we may say that the 20th century could be rightly be called the age of the masses. From Le Bon to Canetti, we have seen an age of masses that was becoming, by the end of the 20th century, an age that we may describe as the age of nationalities or the age of minorities. Could it be that now in the 21st century, we need to shift our conceptual paradigms? We need to address a different situation. And no longer what Michel de Certeau talk about as cultures in the plural. We need to overhaul the model of identification, of mass hysterization, maybe of mass delusion, and maybe we need to see what's happening, because there was a moment at the end of the 20th century that maybe was the age of minorities, and it is in the context of the US that minorities are being not only chastised, but persecuted. There was a list recently passed in which, for instance, the word Latinx, the word minority, the word race are forbidden. Federal institutions cannot use that word. It's a list of many, many forbidden words. So if we agree that today crowds that have been formerly replaced by minority groups are now being persecuted in the name of a unified all, what can we say about the current moment? We saw it starting already in Argentina with Milei. Now in the US, we have a similar moment with Trump and this gesture to reduce government expenditures in order to destroy the state. The state is seen as the enemy. I want to conclude by addressing in this move to eliminate, to destroy, to unify, to create an homogeneous element. The right-wing American politicians' insistence on legal restrictions imposing biological gender essentialism. A declaration that paradoxically was done to defend women. Trump said last Wednesday, women are getting very hurt by trans people. I don't know exactly what he means by that, but in the name of supposedly all women, there is a need to erase trans existence. And as we know well, one of the first presidential decrees of Trump was to declare that only two genders, and those genders correspond to the sex declared at birth. I will conclude saying that looking at recent political debates, I wonder, I cannot stop asking myself, why is the trans experience creating such a strong backlash? Is it that perhaps the trans experience is showing how arbitrary and at times non-important the function of the phallus may be? Is it that trans embodiment makes explicit a fact that Freud observed very early on, and it's made very explicit. Here is a quote from Analysis Terminable and Interminable, and a quote from Freud. What constitutes masculinity or femininity is an unknown element, which is beyond the power of anatomy to grasp. Are we trying to eliminate the space of the unknown? We are all fundamentally sexually polymorphous. If our sexual identity may seem settled, in fact, it is not fixed. It is a constant becoming that remains fluctuating. This is suggested by the Lacanian idea of a mobile set of sexuation patterns. The formula of sexuation could be read as mobile positionings. And I always make this silly joke that, like in yoga, if you stay for too long in a position, it starts hurting. So one could not be always the same. And there is a certain reaction against this possibility of a precarious, constant remaking. And we know well, as Jacqueline Rose writes, that there is a resistance to identity at the very heart of psychic life. And we have a government gesture to try to solidify identity as if that would be a permanent thing at the expense of erasing other forms of identity. And one thing that the trans experience has made quite evident is that this is something that Jacqueline Rose explained very clearly. There is constantly an internal processes of rediscovering our sexuality. It's a never-stopping process, and that in a way this belief that some people have access to gender naturally, while others have not, and therefore they have to be excluded, would reify a relationship that is not as stable as it's imagined to be presented. For weeks now, both Trump and Musk have been spreading these baseless claims that, for instance, the government was spending $8 million or more billions of dollars, the numbers are astronomical, funding what was described by Trump as transgender surgery on mice, sex reassignment on mice. But it was completely a sort of this lexicon of Trump, because he misunderstood transgenic for transgender. And here I wonder if they are going to eliminate anything trans, next thing will be transference. So beware, analysts. We will be able, I don't know how we will explain what happens in analysis anymore. Curiously enough, in a totalitarian gesture, on March 13, while speaking to the press, again, Trump complained about how much he keeps hearing about the transgender community. And I quote, he said, "Everything is transgender. Everybody transgender. This is all you hear about. And this is why we won the election in record numbers." I'll stop there.
Thank you, Patricia. So many very, very interesting points that we can retake for sure in the conversation among all of us. This aspect of segregation and the identity politics, the persecution of language, beautiful. Thank you so much. Let's move with David to talk a little bit about Mexico. Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum has responded to the US tariffs energetically, with a message of no subordination, yet diplomatically seeking cooperation and advancing with caution. Sheinbaum also has called out the states for being the main consumers of drugs, the fentanyl, and also for selling the weapons to the criminal organizations known as the cartels, recently defined by Trump as terrorists. So this, I was thinking, this accelerationism we live in today forces the subject to inhabit shockingly contrasting realities in the same time, in the same place. Perhaps it's estimate, perhaps it's the dislocation of the inside outside. I was thinking the beautiful ceremony of the International Women's Day in Mexico last Saturday brought out a sublime ceremony to celebrate 2025 as the year of Indigenous women. And in contrast, the same week with the traumatic horror of the suspected death narco camp in Tehuitlan, Jalisco. How do you see Mexico's situation, David, in light of all these intensities we face?
There are obvious differences between Trump and other US presidents. It is necessary and important to analyze these differences. We must not deny them, but we must also consider, with Duns Scott and later Lacan, that differences and even contradictions are always established within a structural identity that gives meaning to opposite and different terms. Let us think specifically about the identity between Biden and Trump. This identity is emphasized by a large number of Mexican people. I think also that there is a kind of difference in the opinions about what is happening now in the United States. Many people in the streets don't think that it will be so different with Trump than before. Like Trump, Biden was a staunch ally of Zionism and an accomplice of Netanyahu in Gaza genocide. The Biden administration systematically violated the rights of immigrants and deported them in large numbers, also like Trump. Biden also resembles Trump in many other things, such as his complete subordination to capital, the defense of neoliberal capitalism, favoritism toward those close to him, the discretionary use of tariffs in favor of the United States, the reproduction of neocolonial trade relations with the global South, and the imperialist interference in other countries. Considering all this, one could almost say that Biden was a kind of Trumpist, more moderate Trumpist. What is certain is that Biden and Trump are not as different as they appear at first glance. It is difficult to detect important qualitative differences between them. It seems that the differences are more of an intensity or degree. Perhaps we can say that Trump is the same as Biden, but worse. Or perhaps it is more correct to maintain that Trump is nothing more than the continuation of Biden by other means, more extreme means, as in Clausewitz, where war is a continuation of politics by other means. Trump is something like Biden without political correctness, or better yet, Trump is Biden who comes out of the closet. Trump is an unashamed Biden, more sincere, or if you prefer, more obscene, more cynical. Trump's greater obscenity and greater cynicism, like his other attributes, are obviously not his attributes as a subject of the unconscious, of desire, as conceived in psychoanalysis. These attributes are rather, in Marxist terms, Trump's attributes as a particular personification of capital at a specific historical moment. As early as 1848, Marx and Engels noted how cynical and obscene capitalism was compared to feudalism. This cynicism and obscenity are accentuated in neoliberalism and then further accentuated in neo-fascism, in the advanced neo-fascist phase of capitalism as personified by Trump, according to me. What Trump personifies, neo-fascist neoliberalism, is not accepted as such by many political analysts. Many consider it an essential contradiction and therefore an impossibility. According to them, the same thing could not be both neo-fascist and neoliberal, since fascism would be the opposite of liberalism. This idea is not only a liberal illusion, but also sometimes it serves as a ploy to exalt liberalism because of its contrast with what was most repudiated in the 20th century. In any case, this is a mistake, as Franz Neumann demonstrated almost 100 years ago by exposing the ultra-liberal capitalist foundation of Nazism. What Neumann demonstrates is what we have always known in the Marxist tradition, that Nazism and now neo-Nazism, like fascism and now neo-fascism, are defensive expressions of capitalism in its moments of deep structural crisis. These pathological expressions are symptoms in the strict psychoanalytic sense of the word, a sense invented by Marx, as we know from Lacan. In this psychoanalytic sense, the symptom personified by Trump reveals a truth that was better concealed by Biden, Obama, and others. The truth revealed by Trump is, for me, the truth of capitalism. This truth is that of the essential operations of the capitalist system: class division, exacerbation of inequality, concentration of wealth in certain countries and people, exploitation of man by man, instrumentalization of laws and institutions, commodification and resulting corruption of everything that exists, prioritizing commodity exchange value over the intrinsic value of things, degradation of culture, devastation of nature, and extraction of the living to convert it into more and more dead money. Typically, all of this is covered up and in some way repressed by the capitalist state. But Trump uncovers it, thus allowing a return of the repressed. Trump thus operates as a symptom, as the personification of the neoliberal and neo-fascist symptom of capitalism. Thank you. We're not listening to you, Hilda.
Thank you. Thank you, David. I just put it quiet, forgot about it. Thank you so much for that aspect of the symptom. I think is a very, very rich point that we can continue discussing. Let's move to Brazil with Mario Eduardo. In the Americas, Brazil is the only country part of BRICS, an intergovernmental organization for financial and geopolitical cooperation formed by Brazil, Russia, India, China, Iran, and many other countries and partners. How do these alliances present themselves as viable alternatives? Does that deter the lurking Bolsonarism in your country? Tell us your assessment, Mario Eduardo. You are muted.
Okay, thank you, Hilda. So here we are. Without resorting to sensationalism, we must speak plainly and get straight to the point. What is at stake today is nothing less than the very survival of our world. Thus, I propose to approach our current topic, geopolitical discourse in Americas, from a distinct perspective. Rather than outline the crisis as it unfolds in my country, I aim to explore a different avenue. How Brazil culture and its unique singularity might offer glimpses, albeit fragile, yet significant, of a response to the existential challenge we now face. I would like to present some thoughts on how, in my view, Brazilian culture could offer contributions to facing this urgent crisis and we are experiencing. For centuries, European culture presented itself as the very definition of culture, as if were natural, universal, ultimate source of reason, the authority to judge the world, humanity, and our impasses. But let's be honest, this claim has failed. Its supposed objectivity, its pursuit of refinement and progress, none of it prevents us from arriving here at this moment when the very end of the world is no longer an abstract hypothesis, but a concrete, imminent possibility. The West failed to set limits to capitalism's destructive power. It failed to curb the illusions of materialism. And it failed even in its hour promise of symbolic order. The belief that further, a structure, a logic could keep the world in place. We are forced to recognize something uncomfortable. The so-called Western and the civilized solution is incomplete. It has always been. And yet, other worldviews, other rationalities, other ways of organizing social life, long dismissed as primitive, childlike, or outright civilized, now demand their rightful place. And their time could not be more urgent. Because this is not an abstract intellectual debate. It's about the concrete possibility of the end of the world. Brazil, for centuries perceived, both by itself and by the world, either as a land of idyllic tropical barbarism or a successful model of racial democracy, now reveals itself as something else, a point of convergence of the most brutal contradictions of capitalism. The violence over 300 years of transatlantic slavery, the largest in the world, has left deep marks in our culture. Yes, it's crucial to acknowledge that Brazil was the country that received the largest number of enslaved Africans in Americas. Slavery was not an episode. It was a foundational structure, spanning centuries, shaping every aspect of Brazilian society. Almost 5 million Africans were forcibly brought to Brazil. That's more than 1/3 of the entire transatlantic slave trade. And almost 700,000 did not even survive to the journey. The cruelty of these practices, the systematic objectivation and dehumanization of Black people did not simply disappear with abolition. It inscribed itself into the very fabric of Brazilian history, into our contemporary subjectivity. And the same logic applied to the indigenous peoples who originally inhabited these lands. They were not only decimated by European disease, but massacred, enslaved, and erased. Their culture were invalidated, overwritten, silenced. And yet, despite centuries of relentless violence, enslaved Africans and their descendants, survivors of the Brazilian diaspora, and indigenous people who resist extermination have left us a legacy of resilience and wisdom. They remained alive not only in the body, but in the culture. At a time when the world is terrified by the possibility of its armed collapse, is there not something we must learn from them now? From a strategic perspective, it's possible that our recent history has never presented a more, from a strategic perspective, it's possible that our recent history has never presented a more favorable opportunity to empower and amplify the voices of who have been historically marginalized and disfranchised within our culture. Just to finish, just to conclude, we did not listen to the survivor and descendants of indigenous people who conceive of life as inseparable from the land, from the environment, from the forest. Among the many life contributions brought by enslaved Africans to Brazil, could not learn from their traditions for their vibrant and vital corporality, their deeply social form of rationality? Could we not learn from the forms of subjectivity, which are not necessarily centering on the individual ego as the supreme value, but instead grounded in an ecological conception of being, one that operates every level of singular and collective existence? And perhaps the most pressing question of all, what their forms, successful despite the extreme conditions of violence to which they have been subjected, of resistance, resilience, and vital and cultural affirmations? In other words, an other world is not merely possible, it's now necessary and indispensable, but it must be built on new foundations, foundations that do not yet exist. This is not about simply returning to the past traditions, whether Western African, Oriental, or indigenous. Rather, it's about restoring voice and dignity to those who have historically been relegated to erasure and exclusion, but who now must illuminate a new collective effort, one that will allow us to rebuild the very foundations of our civilization. A final word about the role of psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis cannot stand aside. It cannot remain unchanged. It must face itself, interrogate its own foundations, and ask, whose knowledge has been left out? Because psychoanalysis, too, is deeply rooted in a Western, European, capitalist, and patriarchal tradition. So I leave you with this question. What would psychoanalysis become if it truly exposed radically to the otherness of local and diasporic African heritage in Brazil? What would psychoanalysis become if it were transformed by the wisdom of our indigenous peoples. I stop here. Thank you.
Wonderful, Mario Eduardo. Very, very important points about the kind of the return, regaze, reappreciation of the collective epistemologies urgently needed. Thank you so much. Let's go with the Daniels. Last but not least, the Daniels. Let's go with Daniel Tutt. It seems that we are changing a paradigm. Within the framework of late capitalism, we face effects left by the neoliberal free markets and the libidinal trap of digitalization that paradoxically have led the world towards the precarization of labor and an escalating environmental crisis. These contradictions create fertile ground for the rise of authoritarian figures who promise stability and protection because it is hidden in the need for a master. Daniel, you have worked around the politics of the family, micropolitics, political ontologies. How do you see the situation at present in the world, in your region?
Thank you very much, Hilda. And good afternoon, friends, comrades, colleagues. It's a great honor to be with you. Not so much a great honor to speak on behalf of the United States. So I formally submit an apology. But let me share with you my interpretation regarding the paradox of the Trump moment, the second Trump moment. I say paradox in part to pull from what Patricia said regarding segregation, because when you travel across the United States, you notice that there is a profound indifference to the gutting of the U.S. state apparatus. How do we account for this paradox of a seeming jubilation on behalf of the Trump coalition to the destruction of the American bureaucracy? Why is there such a profound indifference to this destructive operation? I want to speculate with maybe the assistance of Lacan, who we know from 1967 to the mid-1970s prophesized that the future of capitalism will be segregative, based on the fusion of the discourse of science with the discourse of what he calls the university. And this process creates a revolt against what Freud terms the artificial groups in his mass psychology, which is not just the church and the army. It also, I think, could incorporate something like the bureaucracy as such, yeah? What is the problem? The problem is precisely that the artificial groups possess a paternalism over the subjectivity of the people, and there therefore emerges an obscure type of revolt against the paternalism of what in Marxist thought I like to call, building off of Leon Rosicner, the great Argentinian Freudian Marxist, bourgeois groups. So imagine if we take Freud's category of artificial groups and we supplant that with a conception of class, and we see that Trumpism, and I want to say something now about what the class composition of Trumpism is. It's a mystery to many. All I have is speculations regarding the class composition. I think we could discuss it. But I think that the class composition describes the sadism, yeah, and the indifference and the antisocial affect of the fusion of the financial aristocracy with the petty bourgeois. What exactly is the petty bourgeois? It itself is a complex category in Marxist thought. It is not merely bourgeois, but it is either downwardly mobile from bourgeois, or it is seeking a relief from the paternalism, which it sees as oppressive of the state. So it is that fusion also with the work of Clyde Barrow, and even Samo Tomczyk writes very well about this, of the lumpenization, of the category of the lumpen proletariat, which Lacan was very fond of speaking of in the 1960s, by the way. In what sense? Because the working class has itself become lumpenized in the US. And it is this resentment, right, of this austerity of the cost of living, of the paternalism of the bourgeois groups, and the indifference of the liberal bureaucracy onto that deterioration of their quality of life, which makes this sort of signifier of Trump and Elon Musk one of a perfect identification for this class composition of dejection. It is a class composition of dejected, what Bernard Stiegler calls the new barbarians. The new barbarians who have this pleasure in the destruction. Yeah. We should also say that there is reason to be optimistic that the mechanisms of liberal bourgeois power will also halt, as we are seeing, some of this destruction, in part because they have a non-relation to the productive system of labor. They think this Silicon Valley notion of creative destruction, yeah, which Elon Musk personifies, right, and which he himself, I think, becomes a site of identification very similar to Trump, which is almost at the level of a mythological identification, precisely as an aristocratic figure of pure luck, a figure of the billionaire as a kind of exceptional figure of pure luck. We should remember, in the other side of psychoanalysis, Lacan had a very interesting thing to say about how the singularity of subjectivity still retains an old conception of aristocratic luck. The capitalism does not dissolve the aristocratic identification of the figure of luck. Yeah? And this is, I think, the identification with Trump. Okay, is he a father? Is he an obscene father? Maybe, but I don't want to generalize it like that. I think rather, as David says, he stands in as a point of a symptom, but also as an identification that we psychoanalysts should really think about very carefully. What precisely is this operation? And what precisely describes the segregative revolt against liberalism? Moreover, what describes the absence of a collective revolt of the left? Why is the left passive, relatively passive this time around? And moreover, why was Steve Bannon, the, I think, evidently neo-fascist figure of Trump, not able to do what Elon Musk is doing now, which is this pure destruction of the US state? It, I think, is because of Musk's position, not within the formal dualism of the capitalist system itself, just like Trump. Now, in Marxist thought, I will wager that this identification is what we call Bonapartism. Bonapartism. What is the meaning of Bonapartism? It is an identification with a figure outside of conventionality. Okay? And it is that identification which permits the destruction, because it comes from outside. Steve Bannon was not sanctioned to do this because the unpopularity at a democratic level would be immediately apparent. But Musk, because he possesses this mythological aristocratic identification of luck, of pure billionaire success, and so on, which of course needs to be thought, I think, in the American liberal cosmos of Algerism and its whole entrepreneurial dream. Because you see, I myself, and I will wrap up my remarks, I know we have limited time, come from a family that is full of Trump supporters. I myself am not a Trump supporter, but I have listened to the rationales for why he has emerged. And it is, as Patricia mentioned, something that we need to very carefully pick apart, because the points of identification in the second time around that Trump has won defies all of our conventional placements of race, of class, of ethnicity. Something after the pandemic has upended all of those conventional points of identification. Why is it that in the hip-hop world of rap music, for example, Trump represents this point of identification of a figure who is like a kind of figure that I think we really need a Nietzschean analysis of ressentiment. It's mandatory. Trump is the locus of the resentment of modern capitalism in an ingenious way. And he is an artist of resentment, capable of turning it all around. So in my second section, I wanted to say more about segregation, because I think that it is very, very essential to understand this strange absence at this moment, which is the heart of the neo-fascist danger, the absence of any social bond that would be capable of seeing the pain that could come in the face of destruction. We are getting an experimental witness to a destructive process which could scale itself in the future. So at this moment, we have to see that for what it is, even if it is stopped by the democratic procedures of the liberal state, which of course we hope that it is. But you see, the problem is that we are being tested about a possible expansion of destruction at a mass scale. And if that is made possible, that, my friends, will be the foundation of the new fascism. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Danielle. Yeah, no, definitely lots of anxiety, lots of kind of ideas about sometimes the identification with the apocalypse is very attractive to some. I hear it in the clinic, right? Like the end of the world as if it was like a slate, you know, beginning something new, something refreshing. It's very religious, but it is precisely identification with we will be in Mars with the 1%. Like it's just so powerful at the same time. But thank you so much. And let's go with Daniel Scarfo. I'll just read, in the past week, Argentina faced protests and violent clashes with police when thousands of retirees supported by soccer fans and leftist groups protested in front of the National Congress in Buenos Aires against pension cuts implemented by President Javier Milei's administration. La represión avanza, they say. The oppression advances. Javier Milei's psychopathic behaviors makes often scandalous headlines. We know a little bit that his motosierra politics, whose emblematic object he gifted to Elon Musk, suggests that toxic masculinity politics seem to be essential to this form of authoritarianism, as some of you have already mentioned. What can you tell us about your region's situation, Daniel?
Hello, Hilda. Hello, everybody. Thanks again for the invitation. The spiritual atrophy of our culture created room for these fragmented forms of philofascism. I'm not sure we can literally talk of fascism yet. Someone just pointed out that so far there is no ideology or attempt to replace the system for another one. A true fascist, by the way, would not want to destroy the state. It is a rebellion against the limits of the system. That's one of the reasons why it seduces people. And of course, Argentinians will love rebellion. In Argentina, the crisis of the state also opened the way to right-wing philo-anarchist discourses. And Milei monopolized the discourse of freedom, which included, besides the pandemics and the locked horizons, the limits of a tale and of political agendas that the opposition tried to make hegemonic, not reflecting the long-term density of a culture. Partial memories generated, like also David pointed out, a return of the repressed. And populist Peronism in Argentina did his share. In the last decades, we gained an appreciation for individual freedom, losing security. New identitarian alternatives emerged, and now nowhere you can certainly affirm that you're at home, sound and safe. The race of individual freedom tends to coincide with the race of collective impotence. There is a connection between the absence of law and the glorification of individual freedom that anarchism knows well. That's why neoliberalism in Argentina extended like nowhere else in the 90s, being an example for the world. It was only possible due to a strong anarchist matrix in our culture that also partially sustained Peronism. We live in cultures of war and symbolic violence, of psychological bullying in everyday life, of the fall of the public citizen. And when violence becomes a form of identification, a culture of violence emerges. I refer to a cult of violence in relation to images and representations that group and collective identities are built upon. Identities of violence are all those that recur to conflict as a unique force. A culture of violence where the limits between licit and non-licit are not clear. Culture that attracts immoral individuals and institutions interested economically and politically in war stages. Passions that have been cooled down re-emerge with a radical violence, also in these psychopathic characters. We change the public good for the freedom of pursuing individual satisfaction. The tendency to self-praise of some of these political leaders speaks of a defective evaluation mechanism that has made aggressions more likely and conflicts more expensive. War is carried on by people that have an optimum opinion of themselves, an excessive confidence, and the illusion of control. And whoever is in a position of power sees his inclination to contemplate others' points of views diminished. Some religions predicate love inside the group and genocide hatred outside of it, like it happens with all those groups considered the chosen one, with a totalizing and privileged vision of the world. In this way, corruption and death have been always justified in history. I will be provocative in this Salon Lacan from the very beginning. Is it possible to think that decades of psychoanalytical practices and also today's popular personal coaching could have unknowingly helped as narratives that take care, above all, of the self? The encouragement to personal interests has eroded our sense of belonging to a community. The cultural transformations have weakened the image of the us that allows to tie webs of trust and social cooperation. So the problem is not about left or right for me. It is cultural and manifested in the arrogance and impunity of an ignorance that crosses all over the political rainbow and also lies in the incapacity to distinguish fantasy from reality. It is a problem of not knowing and not being able to read. Very serious in times of an educational tragedy and brutalization. Critical judgment and competence are forbidden as a presumption from who feels superior, and we reward adventurers. The old culture of work and study is lost. Politics are used for criminal purposes, and the political class uses the system to personally enrich themselves. This eroded confidence in the state and in politics. Democracy is threatened by this. Borders between crime, business, and politics have become blurred. Banks allow corrupt statesmen and criminals to hide vast amounts of money while they reinforce the power and influence of the actors that use them. There is a symbiotic relation between elites and criminal groups that enjoy the banking system's lack of transparency. The perception that scammers and thieves govern the world grew, and also did distrust towards politics. We live in meaningless times without commitments and with true standards that fall apart. Cynicism in front of ethical idealism is a reaction to our present reality and to the tragic way in which ideals were destroyed by political leaders. These have been buried under centuries of teaching that tied good life to richness and acquisition. And Millet in Argentina translated the vital energy and rebelliousness of change before the ruling sociocultural nihilism. We are under a mode of domination founded in the institution of insecurity, based on the precariousness, uncertainty, and vulnerability of existence, the feeling of instability associated to the disappearance of fixed points where to situate trust. In this quietude, many of us often live in a terrible anxiety and a feeling of no way out, anguished, sad, and in fear. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. I was thinking these ontologic anxieties, no, that you bring them so clearly in your words, and how that might be connected to the resentment that Tutt was talking about, right? Like when there's a privation of, you know, the essential aspects of life, housing, food, healthcare, how these potentiates paradoxically identifications with with this richness that is so unreachable. But yeah, there's so many points to discuss, but let's move in the order that we want, whoever wants to jump in, about what are our horizons in all of these crises. What is the prognosis? What can we do a little bit, and then we will go, like, just go individual in whatever you want to say about that aspect, and then we will go into a discussion, all of us, and invite some questions from the audience. So who wants to go? Who wants to jump right away to talk about the horizons?
I can
start now if you want, given the fact that I was the last one.
Okay, Daniel, Scarfo, and then I'm Johal.
Okay.
Yeah.
We must, talking about horizons and challenges, we must move from lament to challenge, definitely. Sometimes you have to visit hell in order to understand and purge evil. I think new violent wars can be expected, and probably a new pandemics and repression, and maybe one of these catastrophes to come, or both, will be the point of departure, or I thought that during the pandemics, of a new planetary citizenship, given the absence of political and intellectual ambition in this regard. And meanwhile, it is quite likely that hackers' capacity to work with governments in order to manipulate political processes will grow, while personal identities are used to or by control government agencies. The crime and the world, I insist, is not disconnected from the business and political world, at least in Argentina. We should never stop checking who benefits from the crack that we live and the conflict. The relation between conflict and crime is circular. There are actors fused, and our failure to solve conflict increases the dynamics with crime. That's why we're urged more to find common grounds than a common enemy if we want the future to look not so dark. We face today an apocalypse without vision or perspective. A good life will only reappear recreating language and our world with new expressions that allow a way out, at least an imaginary one, but maybe not only, due to the creative power of poetry. A way out from these hellish days and their entropy. But we can only find way outs inside what we already are, like the monkey in Kafka's A Report to an Academy. We need to found imaginary eras against the vulgarity of history. We need to imagine a new international movement, like Derrida once wrote, without party, country, national community, or citizenship. There is a history of other libertarian traditions, older and very different. The Christian one, stressing brotherhood, for instance, thinks of Tolstoy's anarchism, and the Greek one asking for a world citizenship. Those traditions remind us that all the world should be our home, that there will be no foreigners anywhere, or passports or visas impeding free circulation. An ecological libertarian utopia would also be possible in these times. We need another narrative to generate new institutions according to the drastic technological and social changes experienced. We should reconnect the experience with some non-consumerist or fundamentalist moral horizon. Difficult it is to keep the horizon when we gave our back to our critical culture as an orienting compass in a world devoid of meaning, and instead adopted a prosthesis culture in which medicine often sickens us, school often brutalizes us. What happens to us is the result of the absence of a project, a model, ideas, and will to rebuild. History and poetry should copulate in order to recover humanity and protect a world where dialogue can survive. There are no perspectives if we do not foster the emergence of socio-poetic forces with enough power to go in another direction. And we should not lose hope. Things that might look very bad can have very good results. We have to rethink how culture acts through passion. What happens with our capacity to be affected? Only giving visibility to these passions, finding a dialogue between private and public passions, we can rediscover meaning. We will need to translate our tensions and discords, listen to the passionate confessions of ever more solitary people, and give them an expression to allow them to skirt the precipices towards which they slide. We need to give visibility to those passions that tend to get lost. The very meaning of what is human is at stake these days. We urgently need a convivial reconstruction of the house and of ourselves, and we are urged to recover the emotional as a fundamental realm of the humane. We need a planetary feeling and a cosmopolitan tradition to survive, threatened as it is today in the world, one that believes that our own culture gets richer, asking itself about itself, feeding from different civilizations. There will be no future without a gigantic cultural reform. No serious projects in this regard are visualized in any political sector. We need to create a new culture enriched with experience of centuries. Our contemporary challenges come above all from the cultural changes that are taking place and from our emotional education. New cultural leaders must invent what can be done and modify the way in which we see possibilities. Political forces know the importance of the cultural question. That's why they pose it. Its potential to transform, its capacity to generate experiences and an imaginary that could allow the community to expand its possibilities of action. That's why, because they know it, they stole it from us as they appropriated freedom.
Thanks, Daniel. Lots of things there. The recuperation of humanity, and the resonates again what said before, the borderless, the sort of the no thinking about nationalism, which is something that is resurging. And then Daniel Tutt.
Great. I'm going to talk about sort of this mode of destabilization as political strategy, which is prevalent around us, and the attempts to influence elections in the upcoming federal election in Canada, which is literally days away from being called. We're already seeing through Fox News algorithmic interventions that mirror the foreign interference that the West often condemns, that we're going to actually see the greatest interference in the Canadian election from the US, from Trump, from Tucker Carlson, from all of the people supporting the Republican. They very much have sided with Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives. And so there's going to be very much a direct relation and intervention happening, and the strategic use of chaos benefits these opportunists who thrive on disorder and extract power from a fractured political landscape. I think it's good to unpack what might be called the thing called Poilievre and the thing called Carney, but I'll come back to that. The end of the post-Second World War order and the great power competition, this rise, as a number of you have all stated, that Trumpism, it's symptomatic of the decline of the US-led post-Second World War consensus. The decay of international institution has been well underway for some time. The bravado and militaristic rhetoric are markers of a waning empire grappling with insecurity in a world where power is shifting and has been shifting for some time, just as in previous centuries, the kind of colonial and capitalism of those areas where, Britain and France with naval power were in dominance, the US air power in 20th century, and now with China as a rising superpower attempting to rewrite the rules of the international game. And this is destabilizing for the US. So global capitalism is facing another cyclical crisis, exposing the rot at the core of the international rule-based order. And we add to that, as we've had existential crises in the past, from the possibility of nuclear war, ecological collapse, artificial intelligence, this feeling of being disoriented is a political production that I think decenters many of which of the things that we've held in common. I think the other piece, of course, also is the political effectiveness of the so-called anti-woke agenda that the Trumpism rhetoric focuses on, that it resonates deeply with disaffected working class voters, and the right wing actively fosters this narrative, positioning progressivism as an elite, detached ideology. The failure of the Democratic Party to articulate a compelling material vision for the working class has exacerbated the shift, and this opportunistic, specializing in shock authoritarianism and right-wing version of the drain the swamp, or a distorted sort of Bannon-inspired withering away of the state, is on offer. And as Daniel talked about, why it sort of came to be under Musk as opposed to Bannon, I agree with wholeheartedly. And in terms of building counter movements, the unadulterated domination of trauma and a mobilization of public response has to be countered by new imperfect solidarities. And what does political resistance look like when institutions have been captured or already been totally dismantled and dissolved in a dizzying blitz? And how do we retain the capacity to resist inside this state of capture? How do we remain measured, rational, and passionate in a time of political acceleration and extreme and primal revanchism and resentment? Resistance needs to, focus on constructing new political timeframes and durable movements, preventing justice from being transformed into mere vengeance, making the impossible possible, actively fragmenting the Trump coalition, exploiting market instability, supply chain failures to disrupt these neo-fascist agendas, boycott, stoppages, all of these things to reclaim an offensive. The modern political struggle needs its potency to be drawn from outside the state, but the state must remain in the field of play, because to leave it to the far right would be an unforgivable capitulation because of the material effects that can have. And the digitized synthetic space of political discourse is increasingly detached from material reality, and the consolidation of oligarchic data regimes enables new forms of control, colonizing consciousness itself, but it's not absolute. The vigilance against neo-fascism must extend into the digital sphere, where the battle for new realities is being waged, and the ground beneath our feet is rapidly shifting, and to figure out new ways to respond what is happening on the ground in real time. And just to come back briefly to the Canadian federal election, where we have the thing called Poilievre and the thing called Carney. Poilievre is a career politician. He comes from the right wing of the Conservative Party. He brings those libertarian fantasies into play. There was that interview where he was in a BC orchard where he was eating an apple, talking back to reporters. So this acting out of this alpha male persona, the sheer porousness of the Trump Republican Party and its connection to the Canadian Conservative Party is very direct. The connection to the truckers' convoy, or Steve Bannon's travels through Canada when he was under indictment, the active organizing and amplification of this, similar to the speech by J.D. Vance at the Munich conference to active supporting of far-right movements globally. These are true believers, and certainly in this context with the broader annexation rhetoric, the attempt to tip this election in favor of Poilievre is very clear. It's very transparent. It's going to be actively in play over the next month and a half. Trudeau, who was past his best before date, finally steps down, and this figure comes forward in the name of Carney, not the central banker of one country, but of two. The Bank of Canada, later the Bank of England, somebody who hangs out in Davos a lot. And so for the conspiracy theory set, he's from central casting. He manages, Brookfield Asset Management manages something like $900 billion in assets. And so for, similarly, when we had in a previous era, Michael Ignatieff returned to Canada after 30 years away, the realities of the battlefield of electoral politics is he literally got run over. And so the question of Carney being able to be durable as a political candidate, not being cloistered by the communications people of his asset management firm, or being at a slight distance from the combat of partisan politics. And so, and this figure as well, Carney, his political agenda, as he's laid it out thus far, seems very similar to the former finance minister, Paul Martin, who later became prime minister in the early 90s. So it's very much an agenda of budget cuts. It's an agenda of restraint. And so what's on offer in the mainstream political context is a rightward shift of the Liberal Party, or a further right version of Poilievre. And so this question we've been sort of raising, where is the resistance? The other political parties, their vote has collapsed because people are trying to rally behind who would be the figure to take on this potential annexation and trade war. But the options are further to the right of where we are and further to the right of that. And so I think this question of where is this blockage? Why is there not something more substantial on offer, given everything at stake, given the ground shifting beneath our feet and the collapses all around us? And so I'll return to some of those questions later, but I'll pass it back to you, Hilda.
Yeah, thank you. Well, fascinating. Yeah, like the rise of the right all over the world in a way. No, you are referring here. Daniel, before you leave, because I know you have to leave ahead.
Sure.
Some minutes. Yeah.
So I would submit that one of the crises of the left has been a proper articulation of the function of the leader. Rosichner argues that within the bourgeois groups or institutions, paradoxically, you do not have leaders, you have directors. Directors which shelter falsely the dissatisfaction of the subjectivity of the people and create a type of repression which needs an outlet. Trumpism has, and even Bolsonaro and other forms of these sort of quasi-fascist movements are capable of garnering that dissatisfaction, which is otherwise sheltered and kept at bay. So I think the first prescription would be to ask, how can the left begin to introduce a conception of leadership that would be capable of reintroducing an identification around a symbolic ideal? Because we know from a Lacanian point of view, the success of these neo-fascist groups is that their identifications are not around symbolic ideals based in a social bond. They are anti-social identifications with a surplus excess, with an excess, with a point of obscenity, extreme enjoyment, and so on, right? All of that we know because we've lived it for some time. But what we've been unable to do is construct a type of leader that could focus as a kind of concentrated locus for a type of identification that would be for the enactment of a new vision. Because you see, one of the things that I worry about is that the destruction of the US bureaucracy and the entitlements program, everything that's happening right now, we know what's happening in Argentina, It's being attempted in the US. Again, my prediction is that it will not go as far, but it will go far. It will be bad. The problem is that the Democratic Party will not seek a true structural transformation from that destruction. They will maintain it as a new status quo, which goes exactly to David's point that Trump and Biden are the same, well, in Marxist terms, in 1848, Marx said that you have the party of anarchy and the party of order as the two capitalist wings. Yeah? Trump comes from outside of those two, and he happens to organize all of the discontent brought up by the capitalist system, right? This goes back to the idea of him being a Bonapartist figure. So I'm not saying that the left needs to create its own Bonapartist figure. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying, though, is that we need to rethink, and this kind of goes to the legacy of Ernesto Laclau. In Laclau's vision, the task of the leader on the left is basically to kind of be a coordinator or a conductor of the ensemble of different struggles, whether that be feminist, ecological, class, race, and so on, right? And I think this is what we call left populism. And I would contend that that conception of leader as coordinator of the ensemble of the left struggles, of those who suffer and those who are oppressed, has not borne fruit. And we need to ask seriously why it has not. Why has that conception of leadership not produced the type of hegemonic break with the alliance of the financial aristocracy and the petty bourgeoisie? Why have we not been able to do that? So I don't have any answers. I'm just trying to raise these as questions for you. And unfortunately, I have to take my son to a soccer game. But I have a few more minutes. And thank you, Hilda. Yes.
Thanks. Yeah. No, I was just thinking, I'll give the word to Patricia, maybe. Yeah, if you want to go next. But I was thinking, Morena in Mexico, it did, like, you know, what I didn't like particularly the Lopez Obrador, but I'm, you know, my press is ashamed of, but they did, and I'm not an expert, David probably can say more, they did like a whole turn of the political discourse by creating a new sort of political force that they just went grassroots, door to door, right? Like there's a possibility, and she's a woman that is bringing women issues and sort of a different style of politics. So it is possible, peoples, but right? How do we do it? Yeah. Patricia, ¿quieres ir tú? Next. And thank you, Daniel.
Yes, for this, in the interest of time, I'll be very, very brief. Just, I was talking from the US, that we feel almost nostalgic for the first Trump presidency, seeing what's happening the second time around. And here I was thinking that maybe the temptation is to fall into a melancholic position, a little to pick up in what Daniel Tutt was saying about what's happening with the left. Why isn't there more of a reaction to the horrible things that are happening? Why it doesn't look like there is a leader emerging, or at least a response as a movement? And here I would take inspiration on the idea of Jacques Derrida. I think that pessimism in this case may not be the best way of intervening, because it could be a sort of the end of the world fantasy, a certain melancholic position where there is an impossibility to project ourselves onto the future. We could become complacent. And here I take, again, inspiration from Jacques Derrida, who, unlike Walter Benjamin or Carl Schmitt, kept a certain faith in democracy as a political structure. Daniel Tutt was mentioning, will the democratic institutions manage to challenge what's happening in the US? We don't know yet. And this here, I would then follow the idea of Derrida that democracy is always to come, hasn't happened yet. And that maybe the possibility would be, how could we imagine that democracy and that perhaps we need to continue avoiding the temptation of falling into an anhedonia or melancholic paralysis, and think that democracy hasn't happened yet and is yet to come and needs to be projected onto the future. And there I'll stop to give room to others.
Wonderful, wonderful point. Who wants to go next? Mario Eduardo, David? David, vamos. Vamos, camarada.
As I did in my first intervention, I want to say a few things about how Trump appears from a distance from Mexico, the United States' distant neighbor, as Alan Reading labeled us. From our distance, we don't always fully perceive the fascinating domestic plot that Daniel Tutt and Patricia Gherovici referred to. What we see best is the common ground between Biden and Trump. From our distance, one can even take comfort in seeing how Trump's cynical and obscene appearance, as Daniel Tutt described it, finally confesses clearly, sincerely, at least a small part of everything the US government has always been for us in Latin America. For us, the United States was never exactly the guardian of our democracy, our freedom, and our prosperity. US governments were quite the opposite. Saboteurs of our democracies, enemies of our freedom, and causes of our poverty, whether as invaders, plunderers of resources, sponsors of death squads, promoters of military coups, and unconditional allies of oppressive and exploitative oligarchies. After all the United States has done to us, what more can we expect now? What could be worse than all the American misdeeds we have suffered so far? Many Mexicans, both experts and ordinary people, are alarmed to think that the designation of drug trafficking groups as terrorist groups could provide a justification and legal frame for the United States to militarily attack Mexican territory. Some even fear that the United States will do what it does best, the American government, United States government, will do what it does best, massive bombings, the destruction of cities, the annihilation of thousands of people, and the complete dislocation of society and the state, in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria, and many other places. There are even those who believe that the Trump administration would be capable of perpetrating, either in Mexico or elsewhere, genocides like the one the Israeli state has just committed in Palestine. This seems highly unlikely, but it is true that there are deep affinities between Trump and Netanyahu, as evidenced by Trump's proposal for ethnic cleansing and tourism developments in Gaza. In reality, after what has happened in Gaza, everything seems to be permitted. Perhaps we should see in Gaza an experiment like the Spanish Civil War just before World War II. Just as Europe ended up suffering what it had allowed to happen in Spain, so the world could now suffer what it has allowed to happen in Gaza. What I'm trying to say is that the devastating violence against Palestine could once again be turned against the West. This is also what happened in World War II for Aimé Césaire, who saw in Nazism and fascism an inward retreat of colonial and imperialist violence, so that Europe suddenly did to itself what it had always done in its American, Asian, and African colonies. Sadism thus returned to its masochistic source. One of the great lessons of psychoanalysis, a lesson made explicit by Lacan, is that self-destruction is at the origin and at the end of the detour of destruction. Perhaps this is why the Western capitalist devastation of nature and other cultures quickly turns back towards Western culture and could end up destroying capitalism itself. The problem with the capitalist system is that it directly satisfies the death drive through what Marx represented as the vampire of capital that devours all living things to turn them into dead capital. This distinguishes the economic system of capitalism from the symbolic system of culture, in which the drive can stray and thus persist as the life drive, assuming the drive monism of Lacan. With the advance of capitalism, culture is gradually subsumed within capitalism. Capitalist accounting gradually gains ground on the cultural fabric. Ultimately, only the capitalist system remains, which cannot even survive itself, its enjoyment that Lacan understands as possession for possession's sake and a satisfaction of the death drive. The response or enjoyment of capital, transmuting all living things into more and more accumulated dead capital, cannot but consume itself. This self-consumption of capitalism was already predicted by Lacan when he introduced the capitalist discourse. The same self-consumption was also predicted by Marx. In the end, when everything has been transformed into capital, there is nothing left to transform and the system collapses. The risk of capitalism's collapse is part of what is symptomatically revealed through Trump, I think. Isn't Trump's neo-fascist neoliberalism, with its obscene and shameless appearance, the best expression of the capitalist discourse of capital that tends to eliminate all barriers, to recense all ideological, institutional, and political mediations in our relation to enjoyment, in order to link itself directly to itself and thus destroy itself? The question now is whether we are facing the end of the world or the end of capitalism, as suggested by Johal and Mario Eduardo Costa Pereira in their first interventions.
Thank you, David. Yeah, it made me think about what Varoufakis proposes, that is like the end of capitalism is relayed by techno-feudalism, and how the dematerialized kind of sort of production, it's the production of, and yeah, this is like all over people who are studying kind of, sort of mechanisms in the internet, in the social media, in the digitalization, how we feed the cloud capital. Like, yeah, maybe it's about like finding good technological developments that are collective, right? Like back to the collective. Like it seems like, because even in the academia, what we privilege and what we recognize is like how many books, right? How many things we have accomplished individually, not collectively in communities. Is something that, yeah, it's inside, as Patricia was saying, the other inside, right? Like it's about the individual, not the collective. And Mario talk about those teachings from some cultures that have had it like heavy with imperialism. Mario Eduardo, your last words.
Okay, well, I follow very closely what Daniel Scarlo said during his speech, that we need a gigantic shift in our mentalities. And what you see behind me is a primary rainforest. This forest was here when first the Portuguese first arrived here 500 years ago. And we can see very directly that the destruction of this forest. Now we have only 5% of what existed here 500 years ago. If this forest go away, we all die. And I guess that our traditional solutions are not enough for change this situation. I guess that we can have a very strong contribution from different perspectives. I talked about our African, Brazilian roots, our indigenous roots. We need to change. We need to shift completely our bodily relationship to the world, to other people. I guess that a new left leadership need express in a very clear way this new kind of relationship, of body relationship to the world, to the ecology, to the forest, to the other cultures. And I'm not very enthusiastic with the idea that we can find it in our traditional ways in the left. We have faced this challenge. We have this very charismatic leaders from far right that, as Daniel Tutt said, leaders that are kinds of priests of survalue, and that show us that it would be possible to realize an extreme enjoyment with the promise of capitalism. To change that, we need to present a real, concrete, a bodily concrete, a social concrete possibility of new kinds of existence in contact with other people, with our in a revolutionary shift of living together, and with very soft propositions. I guess that the game is over, not only for the left, but for we all.
Thanks, Mario. Eduardo, I was thinking, connecting your point with Gramsci's maxima, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will, no? And I was thinking
Absolutely.
also with Scarfo, when he says, like, we need to form new institutions as well, right? Like, yeah, the institutions are being kind of dismantled, but can we organize ourselves in a different way to, you know, organize? Because it's like we can have a lot of initiatives, but if it is not connected to others, it doesn't go anywhere. Huh? So if you're okay, what about we have some conversations, like any questions that you have to each other? We have about, kind of 25 minutes. If you have to go, you have to go, but until 12:30 here in Vancouver. There are a couple of 3 questions in the chat. And then we can just, like, you know, sort of hold them and then have our conversation, and maybe we address them there. Would that be a good idea? The first one says, by an anonymous attendee, how should Lacanians relate to the US Constitution in the face of Trump and Musk and potentially the end of the world? Wow, that's a big one. Then we have for David, great analysis of Trump's as the intensification of American imperialism and not essentially different from what Democrats were doing under Biden. David, they ask you if your essay is available to the public. Then we have Desiree Young. I don't really have a question, but I want to thank you all for the generosity of being there, talking about such a delicate issue, as well as Hilda for gracious and valente hosting. Thank you. My comment is more to do with whether if as an alternative, we need more collective ways of governing to rupture the bubble of the idealistic and narcissistic in current politics as a way out. It is something that I believe has allowed marginalized communities to resist and relentless endure very harsh attempts of destruction. Perhaps the micropolitics like this event is one solution under the macro politics. So yeah, there are some questions there. Yeah, anyone that wants to jump, I have some ideas about identification, but I want first to, yeah, kind of hear you talk.
I would like to share some possible actions that I was thinking about. You were inviting us to think of these actions. What can we do? By the way, I agree with Mario's last comments. We need new forms of actions, while old collective beliefs, also intellectual beliefs, academic beliefs, are put into question. Hamlet's despair, remember, emerged from a lack of faith in language and in himself, so he couldn't act. When you see the thick of things, the nausea you feel inhibits you from an action, since you feel that nothing would change, nothing would work. So knowledge often kills action that requires the veils of illusion. We need to examine and know ourselves. It's true, somebody talked about contemplating, but a moral life is related to good deeds, not to contemplation. It works in the sphere of action. So first thing I would say is connect. You cannot have a moral life isolated from society. So we need societies where people are encouraged to act virtuously. But in cities, the way they are organized and pregnant of own self-interest, spaces that are mere aggregations of mutually hostile individuals, the seeds for mutual trust, and that's a key thing for me, trust that has been lost, fight for survival. The cynical vision says that selfish interest is below any ethical action, but many of us, as we know, act ethically in circumstances that don't explain this. So admitting the responsibility for own actions, a philosopher a long time ago called that authenticity, and called us to live authentic lives. We need a more humble relation with the being. Notions like the I, the soul, the individual gave room in the last decades, at least, to a very selfish mode of thinking. We need to create a new shared song to portray our planetary risk. We need new narratives. But these people in power now are the only ones offering a utopic vision. Another reason why they are attractive. Those interested in beating these guys should not allow them to own utopia and freedom as values. Difficult thing to happen when the other candidates cannot hold any utopias. Politics, I insist, should listen to the hidden ailments in the minds and bodies to generate them a new narrative. So we need a new narrative. We left linguistic and civic courage in the hands of illiterate rogues, and as a consequence, politics and its languages are no longer what they were or what they should be. Strangely, because of our ignorance, we seem not to be afraid of this when it's still more dangerous. We are afraid of these trends, but we are not afraid enough of these trends. We see and hear evil, but we don't do anything or don't do enough to stop it, surrendered as we are to the horrifying sensation of a world that nobody controls and cannot even be controlled. So we need to learn to feel, think, and act at a planetary level. More careful actions can be the way of a responsibility of another form of being in the world, like Mario was also suggesting, to help us see ourselves as part of that planetary identity. It is okay to keep a cynical and humorous look to face kitsch reality, but perhaps we should also recover a tragic look to restitute the dignity of the events. When new forms of private and public violence appear, we have to auscultate passions immediately. Politics should translate these passions and give them other expressions different than the ones we have now. And new sentimental education for that is needed. New institutions, as we are saying, for that are needed. As Hilda knows, I abandoned academy several years ago. We need political forces able to act as agents of cultural change, as educators. To put ourselves in other people's shoes must be part of a basic education, and it's not. Being aware of deceit and self-deceit, also for the left, will allow us to defend ourselves and fight in us these tendencies and be smarter in regard to the fictions that we tell ourselves. We need to replace a conflictive model for a cooperative model for the social, having empathy instead of violence as a model for individual action. Literature teaches us sympathy with the other, increases our capacity for compassion, or at least has that potential. So far, we still have freedom to believe in authority, and more importantly, to declare that we don't believe. Dominant images of authority invite to these rejections. They lack the element of protection. So when you see evil, reject it, report it, do something to spot it. Be a rebel like they are. If you want to change this, be a rebel like they are. They also stole rebellion from us. We need rebellious people to try better ways of life, different ways of living. We need to recover the notion for that, the notion of care as alternative to the technological attitude that Heidegger once denounced. A life oriented to being, to dwell on earth, a poetic life. We are a footprint, but also were Socrates, St. Francis, Tolstoy, Thoreau, Gandhi. What kind of footprint are we being, will we be? So I end with this. Exalting poetry as an act in these difficult days can look like a provocation, because for some it might not illuminate or have value when priorities might seem different. But maybe the time requires of poetic courage. If meaning has stopped illuminating the world, a shapeless future asks for poetry not to surrender so easily. I remember that poem, do not go gentle into that good night, remember? Not to surrender so easily, to recover there the question about meaning, a search for beauty, even an act of faith for those that feel the imminence of a presence. And there, poetry can attempt to reunite what has been separated, us, fostering poetically meaningful values. That's what I'm working on. Fostering poetically meaningful values is, I think, indispensable. For those actions, for that kind of action, we need to produce the spontaneous suspension of this belief that once Coleridge said constituted the poetic faith.
Poetic faith, indeed, poiesis. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. This aspect of responsibility and how it resonated with what Am was saying about putting the body, putting the body, the passion of the body, but also there's something that needs to be sacrificed, maybe our endless hours in Instagram or whatever, right? Like there's something that needs to be, but not one by one, but sort of, yeah, that part of the collectivity is always like a challenge, right?
We have lost that. We have lost the importance of sacrifice, the very notion of sacrifice a sacred fact, right? So I remember now when I visited Beethoven's house in Vienna, in Wien, there was a sculpture and a legend from Hölderlin, the German romantic poem, I don't remember it in German, but I remember the translation, which says something like, where risk lies, also lies the possibility of salvation. Where is danger? Where is danger also lies the possibility of salvation. So maybe we should stop being so afraid, given the fact that we're going to die anyway, right?
We will. We will. Anyone else that went? Well, I can say something. Yeah, David, I just wanted to say something about the importance of this identification that Patricia talked and David and Tutt about. You know, like the identification is one of the crucial problems for psychoanalysis, seminar 12, Lacan, because it is the glue, imaginary and symbolic too, but it's the glue that sort of marks the direction of the drive in a way, right? Because it's an ideal that sort of guides that thing. We talk about how the identification, it comes from resentment, it comes from you know, this selling of a utopia, and to break the identification, yeah, some sobering needs to happen in the sense of yeah, some sort of letting go of you know, these aspirations of the values of the rich, no, which has been entrenched as a radical other within, no. So I just wanted to say that the identification is a crucial point, I would say, for this sort of white supremacist, rich kind of ideal, no? Yeah, just wanted to say that. David, please.
I will just say one thing about techno-feudalism, then try to answer to 3 or 4 questions, and then say a few words about the possible actions that you asked for us. Well, first, about techno-feudalism, I'm among those who think we are not in a kind of a techno-feudal moment as described by Varoufakis. Precisely because of its technological nature, it remains a phase of advanced capitalism insofar as technology is not neutral, but rather has a capitalist structure, as Marx demonstrated in the Grundrisse and Marcuse and Habermas in other works. There is nothing here for me that recalls feudalism as it has been traditionally defined, neither the link to the land nor the preservation of knowledge inherent in work, nor the subordination of the economy to culture. But I know that Varoufakis has very, very powerful arguments to defend this idea, but it's a debate in course. We don't have time now to see all the elements of it. Then about the questions, I will say about one question that capitalism is the end of the world. It's another name for the end of the world. It's a slow end that is progressively accelerating as everything is accelerating in capitalism. In the last half century, we have already destroyed half of the planet's wild animal populations, virgin forests, and half of its arable land. The other half remains. We can be optimistic about the debate on pessimism and optimism. We can still save the other half, but we, in only half a century, we destroyed in a less fast, in a slower rhythm, one half of the world. And Trump represents this destruction as he don't want to do anything to save the other half. About another question, I will post the text on my personal blog. It's found under my name on Google. And the other question is about American culture. I think with the person who made this comment that the problem with American culture is a big problem, but it's not a problem of culture as a symbolic system, but of the economic system of capitalism into which it has been subsumed. Culture has been subsumed. It has been assimilated, incorporated. Perhaps no other culture is so subsumed by capitalism as American culture, something that Lacan observed a couple of times. This is no longer a problem of a culture, but of the problem of the destruction of culture. I was 2 weeks ago in New York, and this is what I was feeling. Not another culture, a very problematic culture, but the destruction of culture around me. This is a feeling that I have each time I go to the United States. It is a problem of the reduction of all cultural complexity to capitalist accounting, quantitative accounting. This reduction drowns desire, desire which is linked to the sacrifice evoked by Daniele Scarfo 1 minute ago. This reduction drowns desire into the enjoyment of capital, of which I was. The last thing I want to say is that about possible actions. This is very short. In the face of the response or enjoyment of capital revealed in Trump, there are several strategies that have been developed in the tradition of anti-capitalist struggle, which have repeatedly confirmed their effectiveness and which remain effective today. There is no need to recall them now, and we don't have time, but it is worth referring to some possible actions or attitudes in which Marxist sensibility coincides with that of Freud and Lacan. First, we must distrust the signifiers that have entered capitalist accounting. The big other subsumed in capital is not as reliable as that of language. The symbolic system allows for the reproduction of human culture, but the capitalist system only serves the accumulation of capital. The cumulative response of this capital governs the signifiers that enter the orbit of its system, such as those inscribed in the culture industry or on social media. The importance of poetry that Daniele Scarfo was talking about that is that true poetry cannot be assimilated to capitalism in this way. Second, although we distrust capital, we need to trust the signifier and its power. We must continue to believe in the big other, continue to talk and listen, and continue to discuss. We cannot limit ourselves to acting, for action only has symbolic efficacy in the Levi-Straussian sense, to the extent that it interprets and enacts the roles of signifiers. The rejection of these signifiers is part of the fascist project of what Walter Benjamin described as aestheticization, understanding it in Lacanism as an imaginarization and desymbolization. Neo-fascism is also a rejection of the symbolic of words and thought in favor of headless imaginary specular action. Third, we must avoid imaginary aggressive specular relationships, such as those in which we would respond to American nationalism with Canadian or Mexican nationalism. This is a question of identity, and identity is dangerous. This nationalism, Canadian or Mexican, exacerbates the nationalism that is part of the problem and therefore cannot be the solution. Faced with nationalism, the only alternative for us communists is internationalism. The social bond between absolutely different subjects is what can free us from narcissism of small differences between an omnipotent self confronted by the other. Then we should not delude ourselves with the imaginary omnipotence of our own egos. The individual can do very little. Resistance can only be collective, trans-individual, social, not individual. It should be political, not psychological. Then, nor should we psychologize and thus depoliticize what is happening. The situation is political, not psychological. The problem is neither Trump's personality, character, nor his enjoyment. The enjoyment that should concern us is the impersonal enjoyment of capital in which we are trapped through our production and consumption. And last thing, in the face of capital's response, we must follow Antigone's example in Lacan's 7th seminar and not give in to our desire. We would simply have to give in strategically in order not to give in, like Signe de Coufontaine in Lacan's 8th seminar. And this logic is associated by Lacan to femininity. And I think Claudia Sheinbaum, about you were saying a moment ago, incarnates this very well. In any case, the radical nature of not giving in is crucial. One is radical by going to the root, and the root is desire, a desire like that of communism for me. This communist ideal must continue to exist to keep the corresponding desire alive, but also to not narrow the political spectrum of possibilities. When the consistent right when the consistent left that remains faithful to its radicalism is lost, everything shifts to the right. The left becomes centrist, the new center becomes right-wing, and the right becomes the far right. I think this is what we are seeing now. This is all I will say. Thank you.
Thank you, David, for those very punctual things. We have just reached our point, but what about we say a closing remark and then we wrap up?
Yeah.
Patricia. Yeah.
No, go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Patricia. Wrapping remarks, las últimas cosillas.
Oh, just I'm grateful that we are talking about this, and I think this is a moment where we shouldn't be silent, and this is a moment for exchange like the one we are having today. So I'm grateful for the opportunity, for all the exchange, and I think we should continue talking. Silence, I think, would be deadly in this case. So it's just that. Thank you. Thank you for organizing this, Hilda.
Thank you, Patricia, and all the things that I think have been said. I don't know you guys, but I feel really emotionally affected by your words, and I think that I hope that that can stay with the people who are going to see the recording. You know, yeah, things that have been said here that hopefully percolates into, you know, thought. First of all, thought, and then action. You wanted to say next.
Yeah. I'm going to maybe answer the question from Desiree and in conversation with you just by reading from a few fragments from Friendship and Community that in this book. It's a quote, first of all, from Achille Mbembe. It says, "The Earth's specificity lies in that it makes room for all its inhabitants with no distinction of race or species. It mocks both the blind particular and the bare singularity. It reminds us of how each body, human or otherwise, however singular, bears on it and within it, in its essential porosity, not the marks of the universal, but traces of the in common. As a result, every politics of the living rests by definition on the idea that the living is that which is priceless, and because it is priceless, it is fundamentally beyond measure. As such, it can neither be counted nor weighed. It belongs simply to the incalculable." That's end quote from Achille Mbembe. And the idea that without strong borders, you cannot have a strong nation is precisely the closure that has to be challenged in order to consider a new way of being in the world. Through this porosity, we rediscover the essence of politics and its reinvigoration. It is in the possibility of sharing our fate with others by opening our borders to fight for a world in common that politics can take its proper form. We submit that through friendship, it's possible to apprehend a world where trees can speak, a rock can dance, a starling can turn with the flock, a fish can pivot with a school, and a dog can cut an umbilical cord after giving birth. Our current crises can never be solved by borders. They can only consolidate and exacerbate dead-end orientations and structured forms of domination. Establishing a durability for our collective planetary existence is to abandon some parts of ourselves to share the impossibility and absurdity of existing in a self that is bound to the existence of another, an openness that remains open, always unfinished. To be with is to be inside of a world that belongs in the space of proximity and porosity, both mysterious and intimate. That capacity to touch, to make and remake the world with humans, trees, rocks, animals, is the place where friendship forms the basis of politics. Love and friendship are bound with precarious vulnerability. The potent durability of a contingent we is based around the premise that a community may no longer exist in time. The binding relationship is not a legal commitment, but the mutual creation of a solidarity beyond the law, moving from being with to being for. There is an unaccountability of accelerated time that closes in on itself through the proliferation of fires, floods, displacements, artificial intelligence, careening beyond human or technological control. The right to move becomes non-negotiable as a site of existential preservation. To imagine a world beyond borders and the extension of a carceral landscape is to be inside the reflexive plasticity of dwelling on the earth. To overcome the architecture of violence that functions at a planetary scale, there's a call to be attuned to the constitutive fragility of the critical zones of life and their places of encounter and entanglement that form the basis of a possible resistance amongst different forms of life. It is through the assembling of practices by which living beings and the more than human cohabitate with friendship and hazard the tenuous formation of communities. The return to mutuality, transformative solidarity, the recognition of our planetary vulnerability beyond the limits of reactionary human identities is a call to collectively reinvigorate our existence in the time that remains, to build proximity to a seemingly impossible justice. The organizing of a series of ruptures towards a new life is to think around the inherited order and open the door to the potency and poetry of new thresholds. Through visible and invisible solidarities, where the creative mutations of politics can form promiscuous alliances that surpass contemporary thresholds and modes of the possible.
Thank you. So we reached our Mario, you wanted to say something? I think that everybody say something. Oh, you, Scarfo, you wanted to say something?
Just
Let's go Mario and then Daniel, and then we wrap up. How's that?
okay. Just one or two phrases. I think that micropolitics should go with macropolitics, and both must attempt to achieve the impossible in the most realistic way possible. Thank you so much for this very precious moment of reflection together.
Thank you, Mario Eduardo. Daniel.
Yes, I will just end with this, but first I wanted to thank you, Hilda, for this moment and encounter. I have a question. How come they stole freedom, rebellion, and adventure from us? Now, adventure, rebellion, freedom are fundamental aspects and values for life now belong to these people. Let's go recover them.
Let's go in an adventure, people. Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much to everyone. Patricia say goodbye already. It has been a great honor. I'm looking forward for the next geopolitical discourses panels that we will have here soon, hopefully this year. Thank you so much. Hope, energy, passion, collectivity. It can be done. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Hilda.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks to you,
Thank you,
Hilda.
Hilda. Thank
Everybody.